Korea launched the super-fast 5G network for a number of mobile subscribers on Wednesday, followed by US carrier Verizon. The close race has generated some debate on who was the world's first to genuinely launch the next-generation network. Also Young has the details.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's deep dive into a seismic shift in global technology and trade. Just minutes ago, reports surfaced claiming President Donald Trump is furious over South Korea's alleged pivot away from US technology in favor of China's 5G infrastructure. The headline screams of a betrayal, a move that could reshape alliances and the global tech landscape. But is South Korea truly ditching US tech for China's so-called 5G empire? Or is this a storm of exaggeration in a teacup of trade tensions? Let's unpack the facts, trace the threads of this story, and decode what's really at stake for the United States, South Korea, and China in the race for 5G dominance. First, let's set the stage. 5G, the fifth generation of wireless technology, isn't just about faster phone downloads. It's the backbone of future economies, powering autonomous vehicles, smart cities, artificial intelligence, and even military systems. Whoever controls 5G infrastructure holds the keys to economic and strategic influence for decades. The US, China, and South Korea have been locked in a high-stakes race to lead this revolution. South Korea, a global tech powerhouse, was the first to roll out commercial 5G services in 2019, beating both the US and China to the punch. With companies like Samsung and SK Hynix, South Korea isn't just a player, it's a titan in electronics and telecommunications. Meanwhile, China's Huawei has been a dominant force in 5G equipment despite US efforts to curb its global reach over security concerns. The US, lagging in 5G infrastructure deployment, has leaned heavily on its allies to shun Chinese tech and bolster American innovation. The claim that South Korea is abandoning US tech for China's 5G systems comes at a time of heightened trade friction. President Trump's administration has made tariffs a cornerstone of its economic strategy, targeting allies and adversaries alike. On July 7, 2025, Trump announced 25% tariffs on goods from South Korea and Japan, alongside other nations, effective August 1, unless trade deals are reached.
The trade war just got bigger. The U.S. is slapping 25% tariffs on all imports from Japan and South Korea starting August 1st.
These tariffs hit South Korea's key exports, cars, steel, electronics, and semiconductors, hard. South Korea, which sent $66 billion more in goods to the U.S. than it imported in 2024, faces significant pressure. The tariffs are part of Trump's broader push to address trade deficits, but they've strained relations with close allies like South Korea, a partner in economic and security matters. So what's behind the headline? The notion that South Korea is fully embracing China's 5G tech seems to stem from a mix of speculation and recent trade dynamics. No official statement from Seoul confirms a wholesale shift to Chinese 5G infrastructure. In fact, South Korea's major telecom operators, SK Telecom and KT Corp, have avoided using Huawei equipment for their 5G networks since their 2019 rollout, citing security concerns. Only LG U+, a smaller carrier, has incorporated Huawei gear, and even then, it's a limited partnership. However, recent trade talks among South Korea, China, and Japan, held on March 31, 2025, have fueled rumors. Chinese state media claim the three nations agreed to jointly respond to U.S. tariffs, with South Korea and Japan reportedly seeking Chinese semiconductor materials. South Korea's trade ministry quickly downplayed this, calling the claim somewhat exaggerated, and Japan denied any such agreement. Still, the optics of these talks, coupled with Trump's tariffs, have sparked fears that South Korea might be hedging its bets by cozying up to China. Let's dig deeper into why this narrative is gaining traction. South Korea's semiconductor industry, led by giants like Samsung and SK Hynix, is a cornerstone of its economy, accounting for 21% of its exports in 2024, valued at $141.9 billion. The US is a key market, but China is even bigger, absorbing $46.6 billion in South Korean chip exports last year. This trade dependency creates a dilemma. The US has long pressured South Korea to exclude Huawei from its 5G networks, citing risks of Chinese espionage. In 2020, US and South Korean business groups urged closer cooperation on 5G, advocating for a rules-based trading system and shared standards. But China's economic leverage, 27% of South Korea's exports went to China in 2018, makes it a risky partner to antagonize. The 2017 THAAD missile defense crisis, when China's tourism boycott cost South Korea $5.1 billion, showed Beijing's willingness to use economic coercion. South Korean firms like Samsung and SK Hynix also supply 17% of their electronics parts to Huawei, creating a complex web of interdependence. Trump's trade policies have added fuel to the fire. His tariffs and export controls, particularly on semiconductors, have disrupted global supply chains. In April 2025, South Korea announced a $23 billion support package for its chip industry to counter U.S. tariff uncertainty and Chinese competition. This move signals Seoul's determination to protect its tech sector, but it also highlights the pressure it faces. The U.S. recently imposed 93.5% anti-dumping duties on Chinese graphite, a key battery component, which could raise costs for South Korean firms reliant on Chinese materials. Meanwhile, Trump's decision to lift restrictions on NVIDIA's AI chip sales to China on July 14, 2025, suggests a softening of U.S. tech controls, possibly as part of trade negotiations. This reversal after a 3-month ban shows the U.S. is navigating a delicate balance, trying to curb China's tech ambitions while avoiding economic fallout at home.
Could South Korea be tilting toward China's 5G tech? The evidence suggests otherwise, but there are cracks in the US-South Korea tech alliance. South Korea's 5G networks are among the world's most advanced, and its telecoms have prioritized non-Chinese equipment from Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung. However, if US tariffs continue to squeeze South Korea's exports, Seoul might explore pragmatic options. An open auction for 5G base stations, as hinted by SK Telecom in 2019, could include Huawei if costs become prohibitive. South Korea's trade ministry has also signaled active consultation with the US to mitigate tariff impacts on its chip and auto sectors, indicating a desire to maintain strong ties with Washington. But the longer these trade tensions persist, the more South Korea may look to diversify its partnerships, including with China. Now, let's address the Trump furious angle. While Trump's social media posts often amplify his reactions, there's no direct evidence he's specifically enraged about South Korea's 5G choices. His frustration likely stems from broader trade dynamics. In June 2025, Trump hailed a trade deal with China, securing access to rare earth minerals in exchange for easing U.S. export controls. This agreement, still pending final approval, shows his focus on striking deals to bolster U.S. industries. South Korea's perceived flirtation with China could be seen as a snub, especially as Trump pushes for allies to align with U.S. tech standards. His July 7 letters to South Korea and Japan warned of 25% tariffs unless trade deficits are addressed, signaling his willingness to play hardball. If South Korea were to deepen ties with Huawei, it would undermine U.S. efforts to isolate Chinese tech, potentially triggering a sharp response from Trump. What's the bigger picture? The U.S. is at a crossroads in the 5G race. Unlike South Korea's rapid deployment or China's state-backed push, the U.S. has struggled to build out its 5G infrastructure. A 2019 Defense Innovation Board report warned that China could dominate 5G, setting global standards and gaining an economic edge. Huawei owns 27.5% of the global 5G base station market compared to Samsung's 6.5%, and no U.S. company ranks among the top suppliers. Trump's earlier attempts to nationalize 5G in 2018 were met with resistance from U.S. telecoms, who argued the market, not government, should drive innovation. Meanwhile, China's centralized approach has given it a head start, with over 10 million 5G subscribers by 2019 and a robust network of base stations. South Korea's role is pivotal. As a U.S. ally, it's expected to align with Washington's security concerns, particularly over Huawei. But its economic ties to China and the pressure of U.S. tariffs create a balancing act. The March 2025 trilateral talks with China and Japan, though not a formal alliance, suggest South Korea is exploring regional cooperation to counter U.S. trade pressures. If South Korea were to expand its use of Chinese 5G tech, it could signal a broader realignment, weakening U.S. influence in Asia. However, South Korea's trade ministry has emphasized dialogue with the U.S., and its chip support package shows a commitment to staying competitive without relying heavily on China. Let's talk numbers to ground this. South Korea's 5G networks, launched in 2019, offer speeds 20 times faster than 4G, supporting AI, VR, and gaming. The country's $141.9 billion in semiconductor exports last year underscores its tech prowess. But U.S. tariffs could cost South Korean firms billions, with cars and electronics facing 25% levies. China's 5G infrastructure, built by Huawei and ZTE, accounts for 40% of the global market, dwarfing U.S. contributions. The U.S. trade deficit with South Korea, $66 billion in 2024, fuels Trump's tariff push. But retaliatory measures from Seoul could escalate tensions. South Korea's $46.6 billion in chip exports to China shows its economic bind, as does Huawei's 17% share of South Korea's electronics parts market. What does this mean for the future? If South Korea were to pivot to Chinese 5G tech, it would be a strategic blow to the US, signaling that even close allies prioritize economic survival over security alignments. But the reality is more nuanced. South Korea's telecoms are deeply invested in non-Chinese 5G infrastructure, and its government is actively negotiating with the US to soften tariff impacts. The March 2025 talks with China and Japan were more about supply chain resilience than a 5G embrace. Trump's tariff strategy, while aimed at reducing deficits, risks pushing allies towards China, especially as Beijing offers cheaper 5G solutions. The US must balance its hardline stance with incentives for allies to stay in its tech orbit. So, is South Korea ditching US tech for China's 5G empire? Not quite. The headline overstates the case, driven by trade tensions and speculative reports. South Korea remains a U.S. ally, wary of Chinese tech due to security concerns, but squeezed by economic realities. Trump's tariffs are a double-edged sword, forcing negotiations but risking alienation. The 5G race is far from over, and South Korea's next moves will shape whether the U.S. can regain ground or if China's tech influence will grow. For now, the story is less about a dramatic pivot and more about a high-stakes chess game where every move counts. That's the breakdown. The world's tech and trade landscape is shifting, and the US, South Korea, and China are at the heart of it. Stay tuned for more updates as this story unfolds, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Is South Korea playing a dangerous game, or is it just navigating a tough trade world? Hit subscribe, and we'll keep you posted on the next twist in this global tech saga.